name is Fran Stevens. I'm the Director for Pre-Award Services in the Office of Research Services. And today's session that we're going to cover is about the NIH proposal process. And we're going to go over some different information related to like the timeline that you might want to look at if you're going to be developing a proposal to submit, some of the components that are in most of the common NIH submissions, and common problems or problems that we see and how you can avoid them. A little bit about the review process and how you make contacts and stuff at NIH. And if you have questions at any time, just stop me and let me know and we'll address it then. I'm going to get all these up here at one time, hopefully without going too far. So you come up with the ideal for the work that you want to do, and you put together the team that you want to work with you, and you find the solicitation that you want to submit to. And usually in NIH, these are under different institutions. So for example, you might have work that is going to be addressed with the National Cancer Institute or the National Institute on Alzheimer's and Aging or things like that. So you have to find the institute or institutes within NIH that you want to develop relationships with that you think would possibly fund the type of research that you want to do. When you submit your proposal in, it goes into the institute or solicitation that you're submitting to NIH, and then the Center for Scientific Review assigns it to a study group. And we'll mention a little bit later, there's a way that you can help influence the study group that it's going to be assigned to. Then this study section meets, and they go over the proposal that you've submitted primarily for the merit of the scientific information that's in it. They kind of rank them in how well they think they were. It goes back to the institute, and then the scientific officer and the program officer evaluate it for program relevance. And based on the ranking and everything of these final reviews, it gets its final ranking for possible award consideration. And that's what happens in the advisory council. Usually, if you're going to be selected for funding somewhere in this time frame at the advisory council, you may get some contact back from the program officer or the advisory council asking for some more information or maybe an update on your publications list. Or if they are going to change your budget, they may ask for a budget revision then. But usually they'll preface anything that they send you with an email that says, this is not a notification of award, don't start doing any actions and things like that. And that's really the truth, because they're just making the final list that's going to go into the institute director. And the institute director is the one who actually makes the funding decisions on what proposals are actually going to be awarded or not. So you could be really close to the pay line and still not get selected for funding. So if you're looking at doing a submission and you kind of want to get an idea of how far back out you need to go to start developing things, at 8 to 12 months, this is when they would recommend that you start doing a literature review and getting your preliminary data together. Find out which institute you think you're going to be approaching for the funding. Yes?
So there, for the people in the room, there's a tool on NIH, I think it's called Matchmaker.
I can't remember if that's one later, but go ahead. Yeah, since you.
In case you have never submitted to NIH, you have no idea where and what institute to select. There's this tool on the NIH website, and I think it's called Matchmaker. It's I think it's Matchmaker, and you can just
You answer some questions, yeah.
Right, and cut and paste some of your text from your project summary, put it in there, and it will sort of look at what some of the terms are and give you an idea about what it does is goes through abstracts of people that have submitted to certain institutes, and it will tell you the most likely institute.
Mm-hmm. You put together your research team, and some of that is impacted by the solicitation that you might be going to. It may be something, if it's an early career type of proposal, sometimes you can't have any other co-PIs on it. Sometimes they may request that you have a minority serving institution involved, so that can have an impact on your team. You want to go ahead and submit the information sheet here at OU. That's how you get on our calendar that you're working on a proposal, and we'll help make sure that the correct guidelines are pulled and send you a budget that's been adjusted to the solicitation that you're going for and some other things like that. Put together a one-page specific aims and send that specific aims to the program officer. The program officers are usually very helpful, especially to the newer PIs. They'll read through the one-pager that you send to them, and if you're in the wrong area, most of the time they will go ahead and forward your one-pager to the correct place for you and send you a courtesy note telling you that it didn't apply to what they were looking for, but where they sent it to, or they'll respond to you asking questions or things like that. You should also start to put together the team of people that you want to look at your proposal as you're doing the writing, that can help provide you some guidance and input on, have you addressed all the concerns that you could, how well does your proposal look? And one of the things that you don't want to overlook on putting this review team together is if you contact our office, sometimes we can give you some advice. Talk to your department chairs and your deans. Ask around, see if there's other people who have been recent reviewers at NIH, because they may have a lot of background in the area that you're looking with, and they know what the review teams are looking at. Then you want to start working on writing the contents of your proposal, having reviews done on it. Provide ORS with the preliminary routing information. And for routing, all we need is the draft abstract, that one pager that you should have already done, and the budget on OU's form, and a draft budget justification. So we don't need the completed proposal to be done for you to do the routing, and that gets it out of the way. So we have the permission to submit in our back pocket while you're working on all the rest of the contents for the submission. And then at about 2 to 4 weeks, you should start sending in the components that are going to be put in the attachment to go in with the application. Most of our submissions for NIH go into grants.gov using the CAIUS program that we use for routing. We also have a module that helps do those types of submissions. It gives an extra layer of error checking on it. And one of the functions that we can also do with that is, as we load all of your files, we can do a PDF of the whole proposal and send it back to you so you can review it or give it to reviewers to see the whole package, how it's looking. And then at about 1 week prior, this is when we would recommend that you submit. Now, a lot of PIs, they don't submit before the deadline. Most of the time it's the day of, and I will tell you that that hinders you, because they allow a 2-day window at NIH when you do a submission that is called the validation period. And so everything that goes in processes through grants.gov. So it's going through a lot of servers. It goes through ours, goes through grants.gov, it's pushed from grants.gov into NIH into eCommons. So they post it in eCommons, and you have a 2-day window that you can go on and you can look at what the submission looks like. So if a file corrupted in transfer, or a picture shifted or isn't visible, you have a 2-day window that you can fix it. However, that 2-day window doesn't go past the deadline. So at the very minimum, you should plan to submit at least 2 business days before that deadline. Otherwise, you can't take advantage of that window.
Can you speak a little about that number 7, the review team for this? That's a bunch of people who can look at that proposal before you submit it, right?
Yes,
And you choose them.
You can choose them. Sometimes you can get some help from our office to help, talk to your department chair. It doesn't have to be a big group, but it's always wise to have 2 or 3 people other than yourself who are giving you an external look, because, once you've been looking at something for several days on end, you might miss something really simple just because you've been looking at it too much. So as far as the submission process here at OU, you decide that you're going to submit and what the solicitation number is. You give us the information sheet. You work on the scope and objectives. We help you make a draft budget. You have to let us know if you've got subcontracts so we can help you get together the packages of information that includes that. You send us the final budget and the draft abstract and summary. We take care of the routing. We pull the application package. As you send us the final documents to load, we start loading the documents in your application package. The routing is going on. When the routing is finished, we'll send you a notification that we are cleared to submit, that the routing is done, but we don't hit the button then. We wait for you to tell us that everything is there and you're ready for us to go ahead and submit. Many times, if the routing's done ahead of time, it could be several days or a week or more before we are starting to load any of the final files in the application package. One of the last things that we normally do when we have all the documents loaded is we run an electronic validation check that looks for any missing files or things like that. And we can send you a print copy so that you can look at it. As it is submitted, we're giving a tracking number from grants.gov. That's your grants.gov number. And we'll start to receive several emails. Depending on who your proposal development specialist is, they may forward all these emails to you, or they may wait and just forward certain ones to you. Normally at the third or fourth email, we have a pretty good feeling that everything has transmitted correctly through to NIH. And at about that third or fourth email, that's when you will get an email as the PI notifying you that ERA Commons has posted your information there. And then it's up to you to go on to ERA Commons and look to see if everything posted right or not. If we get an error, we can see that, but we don't know that a figure doesn't look right or that something moved where it's not supposed to be. Then that 2-day validation period closes if you've submitted in time for us to have that, and you get a notice that it's closed. And then it goes into some more manual checking for errors and things like that. So you can make it error-free all the way through the validation period and everything, and still have an error that they find that causes an issue that makes your proposal be rejected. So until it's about 2 or 3 weeks after the submission, you don't know for sure if the proposal's actually gone 100% through or not. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Office of Research Services is arranged and the Center for Faculty Excellence. So there have been a lot of changes lately. I don't know how much you've heard. Post-award and pre-award all used to be under ORS, under the VPR. That was split apart, and post-award is now called Research Financial Services, and they fall under the financial services area. Pre-award, we're still pre-award. The VPR has now changed to the Vice President for Research and Partnerships. And so we're anticipating that there'll be more work in regards to commercialization and things like that as we go down the street. So that's kind of how our chart looks now. Within ORS, we have 3 primary areas that you normally will do business with. One is research information services. They can help look for funding announcements. We still have a program called Pivot that may be going away, but they can help you set up a profile in it to automatically look for funding information. They also send out announcements about if we get notification of an award, of a solicitation that we think people may want to submit to. Your proposal development specialist, you have a sheet that shows who you are with. They are divided by the last name of the PI for the most part, unless you're in a special area, like you submit proposals for Climate Science Center or something like that. They help with guideline interpretation, the budget development, helping obtain special certifications and forms, some compliance clearances and coordination, or they'll tell you who you need to talk to get clearance, and then the actual submission system if it's something that our office can submit. Your sponsored programs coordinator, this is the person that after the submission is done, they help negotiate the award and the terms for any contracts and things like that, and they set up your award account. Once your award account is set up, then your award is handed off to the post-award actions that the research financial services people will do. Sometimes if you have a modification or something like that that goes on with your award, it'll kick it back over into the pre-award services. But most of the time, once you're sent over to research financial services for that award, you'll just deal with them until the award's ready for closeout. So what starts our process internally here is called the information sheet. It's nothing written in concrete. It has a lot of questions on it, so it looks a little bit scary when you first open it up, but you just answer it honestly in the best way that you can. There's nothing in there that if you answer it wrong, someone's going to get mad about or anything. All that'll happen is someone might ask you a question and they'll say, oh, well, that doesn't really apply for this, so you don't have to worry about working with us. When it goes out, it comes to several people within our office, and it also flags like export control and OTD and things like that, depending on how you answer the questions. And that way, if they know that there's something that you need to be aware of, they can contact you and say, oh, by the way, you know, you have proprietary information, we can help you work to protect that and things like that. We set our calendars internally based on when you put in the information sheets. So it helps us as soon as you know that you're going to be doing a proposal to give us a heads up and know, because people may be making plans for doctor appointments, travel to conferences, vacations, and things like that. Another thing I will tell you too is that the timing on your information sheet is important if it's a heavy deadline date when it comes time for your submission, because one of the criteria that we consider is when your information sheet was considered. So if we have you have the same deadline as someone else and you both provide us submission materials at the same time, then whoever submitted their information sheet first is the one that we work on first. First come, first serve. I also want to cover this, how guidance comes down, because a lot, especially the newer PIs, they think that the little solicitation that they gather that has the pertinent information about what is going to go on with their proposal, like what the budget amount is and things like that, is all that they have to have when they do the submission. And that is not necessarily the case. So you have the broad overarching federal requirements that come out. A lot of these are related to budget areas and compliance items within your proposal. Those are under the Code of Federal Requirements, Title II, Parts 1 through 5,999. It also covers auditing for grants and contracts. These are the things that normally the people within our office are trying to help you out with to make sure that you stay out of trouble. Then you have your agency guidelines. So I mentioned this specific solicitation that a lot of times you'll go to get to find out information. Well, almost all the federal agencies also have general guidelines, and they vary in length and content. But almost all the time when you're doing a proposal, you'll have to refer back to those general guidelines to get information like what are the formatting requirements and the font sizes that they allow. But you'll see a lot in NIH, if you look at a solicitation, where when it starts to tell you what's needed for the proposal submission, there will be a little disclaimer in there that says everything follows the general instructions, or it'll call it the 424 R&R instructions, except for the following items. So what it's doing is it's telling you you've got to go back to those general guidelines to find out all the components that you need for that submission, because they're only going to tell you about changes in 2 or 3 areas of that specific solicitation that you're looking at. There are also times that they have what they call special notices that come out, and those usually start with an NOT dash number that may impact the proposal that you're working on. Some examples of those would be if you're gonna have grad students or if it's a training grant, there are notices out there that tell you the minimums that people have to be paid, or that if you're doing a training grant, just various limitations related to that. There's also a cap on executive salaries. So if you have someone, especially a renowned person maybe that's a consultant or an advisor that you're paying on your proposal, there's a good chance that they may be at or above the salary cap, which means they can only be paid that capped amount, or their pay can only be based on that cap amount. You may have state requirements that you need to meet, like especially if you've got a state agency or organization that's involved in your proposal as a subcontract. You also have local policies that you need to meet. For example, the requirements for who can be a PI. If you don't meet our local requirement, then there are things that you have to do to make up for that gap. So just be aware when you're working on your proposal that there may be a lot of different things that you've got to look at for the guidance on what has to go into it. Most importantly for the NIH is going to be the general guidelines, and it's about that big, and the little solicitation for the actual thing that you're submitting for. So one of the ways that you can start looking for your funding opportunity announcements is to go to the NIH site. They have a special section on funding, and this is where it talks about the matchmaker, to help you look for funding. I will tell you that because of laws that were passed in Congress, everything that is being put out by NIH also has to be listed in FedBizOpps and in grants.gov. So those are two other sources where you can go up to look for information. I mentioned before there's a variety of institutions and centers within NIH, and they all put out funding announcements of various types. So some of the different things that they put out are called parent announcements. So a parent announcement is an announcement that comes out usually every 1 to 3 years, and it's large encompassing. Those are normally have numbers like R01, R03, R21. Program announcements are an announcement that comes out related to a specific area or program that they're looking at requesting solicitations for because they've got some money that they want to spend in that area to help out with research. And then they have requests for applications. Those are specific and usually very limited in what they're looking at funding. So for example, maybe they're looking for someone who can go out and do some clinical trials related to a specific problem or drug. So those are more limited. 2 years ago, all of the parent announcements and a lot of the other solicitations had a big change occur, and that is that they split the guidelines and they made one set for those that don't require clinical trials and one set for those that do require clinical trials. And there are so many questions about, is my study or whatever I'm trying to do, is it really a clinical trial or not? So they have a place you can go to, and I put the link here, where it asks you questions, and that helps you determine if it's actually an official clinical trial or not. It is possible for you to have a submission that involves human subjects that isn't considered a clinical trial. So it's very important that if you're going to be using human subjects, that you figure out pretty soon if it's going to be a clinical trial or not, because that's going to govern some of the documents that you have to submit and the actual solicitation that you're going to be pulling to base your solicitation on. And I pulled this out because this definition of intervention, because a lot of people think that intervention means that you're going to be doing something to people, like giving them some medicine or taking some kind of measurements or something from them. And that's not really how NIH defines what an intervention is. So I went to a conference once and the policy person there said, actually, when you read the word intervention, you should translate that as meaning an interaction. If that helps any when you're doing your clinical trial stuff. So when you read an opportunity, some of the things you want to look at are There's applicant review information, usually at the very beginning of the solicitation. It'll give you like your due date, your budget limitation. Sometimes they'll tell you the recommended start date. If they don't give you a recommended start date, you usually want to allow at least 6 months for NIH because it usually takes that long for them to do the review panel and to come up with the results and get back with you. Towards the end of the solicitation, they'll usually list the program officer and some type of a grants contact officer, and the program officer and scientific program review officer are people that you want to talk to if you've got questions about the content of your actual research strategy and your aims and things like that. The person that they put on there for the grants.gov or the contracts contact is the person that usually ORS will contact if we're having an issue with the submission system or something like that. They also have available a thing called the annotated guide, which is where they went through a solicitation and they marked it up with comments to explain this is what this means, this is what that means, and links that take you to other places that explain it so that you can understand the solicitation better. So you've got your opportunity and you're getting ready to sit down and start working on your proposal. So what are some of the things that you need to do? Well, you've got to establish an ERA Commons account, and it has to be affiliated with the university. If you already have an ERA Commons account, then you have to change the affiliation to the university. Your PDS can send you a link to our website where we have a place that takes you to how to do those changes or how to get an account established. One of the recent changes that started taking effect the 1st of October this year was that you need an ORCID registration. This hasn't become 100% effective yet for all solicitations. In October, it became effective for training-related solicitations. But more and more, you're going to see the requirement for the ORCID registration, and it may depend on the solicitation whether or not you see it. So I would recommend that if you don't already have an account set up, that you go ahead and start going through that process. The Center for Faculty Excellence has some information related to that they can provide to help you get started on that process if you haven't started one yet. Usually the solicitations will say something about you needing a grants.gov registration, and that's not the case unless the funds are going to come directly to you. In the solicitation, they're just doing like a general announcement about these are the things that you need to be able to do a submission. When you do this submission, if it's going to be coming through the university, then you'll use the university's registration. Actually, ORS will for you. I mentioned about submitting the info sheet early. One of the questions on the info sheet is called the Public Health Service Financial Conflict of Interest. So you have to, if you've got any conflicts, for example, if you were doing some research with a drug company that could be involved with a proposal that you're putting in, then you have to declare things like that up front. And at the point of the submission, you just have to declare. If you actually get the award, then there's training that you have to go to, and you have to set up some type of a management plan for that conflict. And I would note that this is different from a regular conflict of interest. So you could have a regular conflict of interest and also a PHS FCOI that has to be flagged on the info sheet. A regular conflict of interest would be something like you're doing a submission and you're going to involve a company that you helped create or one that you sit on the board for. Or maybe you're going to hire your brother to be on the proposal. Well, you would flag conflict of interest, and then we would make sure you've got nepotism paperwork on file. Any questions that you have on actually doing the application within grants.gov, there's a guide that you can go to that just talks about how to do the application stuff. I will tell you that unless you're doing the submission on your own, like if you were going to do a fellowship and it was going to be paid directly to you, you really don't need to spend a lot of time looking at that, because that's what we do here at ORS. We're going to help you do this submission and stuff like that. So it's more important that you're looking at the general guidelines and the solicitation guidelines on writing your proposal. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into all of these. So one of the first forms that's pretty much on all NIH submissions is called the 424 cover form, or the 424 R&RA. Usually your PDS will complete this form for you. It has basic information like the university's done and EIN and things like that. When the submission goes in, there's several certifications that are signed for. Someone from our office is the one who certifies those for you. The PDS usually fills that out based on information from the information sheet. So, sure.
Is that a due date, or is that the first day that you can?
That's the first day that you can put a submission in for it. So the question was, there's information about an opening date a lot of times on the 424s, and if that was the first date that you could submit, and yes, that is correct. That's the first date that you can submit. So if data from the information sheet changes, like the title or something like that, try and be sure and let the PDS know, and look at that when you get like the copy to check before the submission to make sure that all that information is correct. If you work in the Stevenson Center, you may want to make sure that your address is correct, because we've noticed a lot of people that work in Stevenson, they like to have the address show their lab down here, but in PeopleSoft, unless they've gone in and changed it, they'll show on the main campus. Another form is the project performance site form. This is also a form that the PDS fills out for you. The OU data is on there on all of them that we're submitting, because it's going to come to us as a performance site. If you have subcontracts, those normally are added as a performance site too, but if you don't want them added, we don't have to. There is information that you have to provide to help load these, especially if you've got subcontracts or collaborators that you want their performance site listed. So for example, we have to have the congressional district, the county, and the zip code +4. Without the +4, the form entry won't take it. So that means if you don't provide it to us, someone has to look it up, which takes time, which we may not have. We have been told that the reason that they use this form is so that they can brief Congress and tell them where the funds are being dispersed on the grants and stuff that are given out. That's how come they like to have the subcontracts listed on there too, so that they can say, okay, we sent $1 million to Oklahoma that was dispersed in these various areas.
Sorry, does that change if somebody's listed as a subcontractor versus a collaborator, or is that process the same?
You can decide how, if you want to list them or not. So if they're a collaborator and they're not a subcontract, and you're giving them some money or not, and you want them listed, you list it. It's just wherever work is being performed. So the next form is the R&R Other Project form. The top of that form has several questions, and I kind of wrote down a little bit about what some of them were. Your PDS normally will either answer those based on the information sheet, or more likely they will send you a file called questions, and they'll ask you to either confirm or to provide the answers to all of these questions. Some of the answers that you provide on those questions are going to drive other files that need to be loaded. So for example, if you say yes to vertebrate animals, then later on one of the other forms, it's going to want a file on vertebrate animals. If you say yes, that you're going to have travel or involvement from a foreign country, then it's going to also ask you what the purpose of the travel is. So like if you were going to a conference, and it'll drive the need to have another file loaded later. Then at the bottom of this form, there are several files that are always required there, such as your project summary or abstract. And there is a link right there on the form that has specific limitations on font and margin specifications, but that's also in the guidelines. The project narrative, the bibliography and references cited, the equipment, and the facilities. Did I go through each of these? Okay, I thought I did. So on the summary or abstract, this has to be releasable to the public. It can only be 30 lines long, and they count the lines. That's how the computer counts the lines. So it's not sentences or anything, it's the actual lines. You want to talk about broad long-term objectives, your specific aims, and the relevance to NIH's mission, responsiveness to this solicitation. There are some solicitations where they will add other requirements that have to be in here, and very seldom do they give you an increase in space. So you want to be sure that you look real close at the specific solicitation, because that's where that information will be. And it may tell you something like, we want you to address this, or to add key terms or something like that, or give a quick list of all your team members. So luckily, we don't see that real often. It's just occasional. The next file is called the project narrative, which isn't a narrative as you would commonly think of. It's only 3 sentences. And they count the periods for that. So we have seen some really long sentences. So it has to be releasable to the public, and they want you to address what the point of your research is as far as impact to the public health is, so that when they say they sent all this money out, they can also say to the public, well, here's why we're giving them the money. Here's how it's going to help you, John or Jane Doe. So the next one is your bibliography and references cited. That's required on all submissions unless otherwise noted in the solicitation. You have to cite all the references that you're using. So it's pretty much the whole proposal, and not just the research strategy, but if you cited anything in your specific aims or your vertebrate file or wherever you cited it is supposed to be listed here. There is no page limit, but you're expected to be as concise as possible. And you can use your URLs in this document. The other attachments area is where if your specific solicitation may say to attach something, and there are some limited items that you can attach here depending on what the research is that you're doing. They caution you quite frequently on this and the other attachment areas. They look at them very closely because they want to make sure that you're not trying to get around page limitations in other areas. One of the ones that I mentioned before, if you mentioned foreign, that you were going to have like a foreign conference or involvement, this is where that file would go. Some of the other things that we commonly see there would be like if you have something like a questionnaire that's going to go out, that you might put a copy of the questionnaire here. But in the general guidelines, it has a specific list of the types of things that are acceptable or not acceptable to put in the other attachment area. Normally, we don't see it used a whole lot unless the specific solicitation says to use it, or somebody's doing a survey or something like that. The facilities and other resources section, this is to explain what you have on hand that makes it so that you are the one they want to pick to do the research for this particular proposal. And not just the facilities, but what's the environment supporting your scientific research? Is your department behind you? What kind of assets do they give you? Is there anything unique that you have that's going to make it, oh, well, we should pick them to do this work because they have this asset or resource that they can apply to it? If you're doing an early stage investigator submission, This is where you want to talk about how the institution is going to invest in your success, the startup funds that they gave you, lab space that they gave you, mentoring that they do, any career enrichment programs like the speaker programs where they have people coming in, protected time to do the research. In fact, a lot of the early stage investigator programs will say that something about the department may have to provide a letter saying that they're going to allow you so much a percentage time to work on your research. The equipment file, again, this is what you have on hand to do the research. And one of the things that you want to think about on this is not only what you have available here, but what do you have available locally that you could use. So for example, maybe there's some equipment that HSC has that you could get access to, or OMRF, or a company or something like that, that will help you do whatever the research is that you're trying to do, that you can use to make your package look better. We do have some examples of some equipment lists that we can give you. I would say though, if you take those, don't just take them wholesale. Think about what you would actually really use in your research. And it is noted in some of the other places on the equipment files is be specific to what your proposal is actually going to need to use. Don't just list stuff just to have a nice sized file for your equipment. The next form is the 398 cover page supplement form. We usually complete this in ORS using information from the PI, so they'll ask you a couple of questions. It's used on all applications except for fellowships. Fellowships have a similar form that is filled out. If you answered yes to vertebrate animals on the other form that we talked about, there will be a couple more questions here on vertebrate animals. For example, are they going to be euthanized and how are you going to do that? If you have program income that's going to be generated with the project, they want to know that. If you're using stem cells, you have to provide the registry number. And you won't see this on the submission, but if it's a renewal or an award and you're trying to change the PI or the institution, you'll provide some information there. The R&R Senior Key Personnel form is next. It automatically pulls the information for the PI based on what is loaded in PeopleSoft. You want to think about people who are going to have a meaningful contribution to the project. I would say we probably routinely have people that are listed as senior key personnel that aren't, just based on the desires of the PI. It's the PI's call. So for example, you've got a high level, very well-renowned person within your field who's agreed to be an advisor or sit on a board for you. Well, they're not really going to be substantially involved, but you want to make sure everybody knows that they're on the proposal. So you list them as a senior key personnel so you can include their biosketch. You can't include a biosketch on anybody that's not listed as a senior key personnel. If the person that you list as senior key personnel is here at OU, we can pull a lot of their information like their address and their phone number and things like that automatically from the system. If the person that you're listing is not here at OU, then we'll have a form that we send you that you have to give us all this information so we can key it into the system. So it's like their title, their director, their division, their college, their address, their phone number, their email. You also will need their biosketch, and if they're going to be another PI, and we'll talk about this in a minute, their eCommons ID number. The eCommons ID number is needed for the PI and anybody who's designated as a PI. NIH does not recognize the co-PI term. You're either a PI or you're a co-investigator or something else. If you are our PI and you have another person who's a PI, as far as NIH is concerned, you both have equal footing. The one who is the lead is the one that they will normally contact for reports and other information. But if you're not available, The other PI is considered to have an equal stake in this project as you do.
There can be like two PIs, or one is PI, the other one is co-investigator.
Right. One, you could be either way. If you say the other person is a PI, then that means they can make the same equivalent decisions as you. They will come to you first if you're the lead, but if they can't get a hold of you, they'll go to the other co-PI, or because they're the other PI, because they consider you this. Okay? Nope. Now, if you indicate that there's more than one PI, you also have to add another file to the submission that talks about who is responsible for what parts of the research that are being done, and who's responsible for what portions of the budget spending, how you're going to make decisions, and how you're going to communicate with each other. So I would say you kind of have to think hard if you want to have a PI or a co-investigator. Oh, yes. In fact, that's the most normal. Anyone who's designated as a PI has to have an eCommons ID. There's no getting around it. If they don't have an eCommons ID, it causes an error on the submission for the whole package. Whoever that you designate for a PI has got to make sure that their profile says that they can be a PI. We didn't know that this was a problem until we did a submission, and we found out after the fact that our PI had a person at a company that they wanted to designate as a PI. So the guy gave us his eCommons ID number. We loaded all of his information. We submitted it. After it got past the validation period, NIH was checking it, and they said, this person's not designated as a PI in ERA Commons. They're designated as a science officer. Rejected the whole proposal, and it was past the deadline. We couldn't resubmit.
Is eCommons the same as ERA Commons?
Yes. Talk about +4. The current format for the NIH BioSketch has, it expires like October 2020 in the upper right-hand column. So if you're getting a BioSketch from someone who does a lot of NIH submissions, or maybe did one last year, year before, you want to double check and make sure that that date's on the upper right. If it's not, then they're using an outdated format. Most of the time, like 99% of the time, a current and pending file is not needed when you're doing the submission. They'll come back and they'll ask for your other support file, which is what they call it, if you're in the final decision phases of possibly getting funded. So that's a good call to get. The next one is the 398 research plan. That is where most of your files related to the actual project go, like your research strategy, your specific aims, and things like that. So the first file place that we can load that's available is for an introductory file. So if you submit a proposal to NIH and they come back with reviewers' comments, but you didn't get picked for funding, then you have an opportunity to submit again the next time that solicitation is taking applications. But you have to address in your very first page the reviewer's comments. You have to respond to some of the overall comments. And you're limited to a page. Then the next file that you have is called the specific aims file. Almost all of the NIH solicitations will have a specific aims file. It's one page unless you're given instructions otherwise in the specific solicitation. And it's just a short thing of your goals and the specific outcomes that you're projecting, and the impact on the research field, and a list of specific objectives. The research strategy, this is like the big gut package of your submission. The page length varies by the solicitation. So there's a link you can go to that tells you how many pages are allowed. So for example, if you're submitting an RO1 type of proposal, most of the time you're given 12 pages. If you're submitting an RO3, most of the time you're only given 6 pages. So When you look at your specific solicitation, if it doesn't tell you, it'll give you that link and have you go and check, and it's based on your number. So R01 has a limit, K20 has a limit. They all have different limits. You want to make sure that you don't duplicate any information that you're putting in your human subjects or clinical trials files. And unless you're told otherwise, they want you to organize this into sections. So the sections are significance, innovation, and approach. And we go a little bit more into those here. The reason they want you to label these by section is because when the review panel sits down, a lot of times that's where a lot of the discussions are going to take place. And so one panel will say to the other panel, okay, look at the comment that they made in the innovation section on blah, blah, blah. So they want everybody to be able to see it, and they want to know that you provided all three of those. So one of the error checks that happens after it passes out of the validation stage is a computer program goes and looks for where you have those sections identified in your file. And if they can't find it, then you've missed a component that'll probably eliminate you from review. So your significance is the importance of the problem or how critical it is in the field, the weakness that you're trying to correct. What is it that makes it important that you're looking at this particular item? Innovation. What are you doing that's different? Are you going to use a different methodology to test it? Are you coming up with a new way to look at something? Is the idol that you have possibly going to change the way people think about how things are done in relationship to the research in this area? Is it something novel or new that you're suggesting? Your approach. What analysis have you done on these specific aims and that they're going to accomplish the work that you're doing? Do you have a milestone chart, or how are you going to address things that have to go in stages that rely on prior activities being done first? And this is especially important if you have a subcontract that's doing portions of the work for you, because if you've got later work going on, what are you going to do if your subcontract isn't able to provide those results to you in a timely manner? And as you're looking at these, and we've seen these on comments before, they expect you to at least touch on what happens if you don't see the results that you expect to see. What's your plan then? Because if you don't have any plan for what happens if you don't get the results that you want to see, then essentially your research is going to stop as soon as you run into a problem, because you haven't thought about what's going to happen next. Well, you might want to talk about that. If you indicated that you had vertebrate animals, then you have to have a vertebrate animals file. We have sometimes had a lot of PIs who didn't go back and look at the general guidelines. And so they just put some information here about, oh, you know, I'm going to get approval from iCook, and I do work with mice all the time and stuff like that. They have specific things that they're looking for in this file. They want you to have 3 criteria and address 2 other items, talk about how the animals are going to be cared for, and cite protocols and things like that. On NIH's website, they actually have a worksheet for how to handle animals that have linked to various things like the Office of Laboratory Animal Welfare and how you're supposed to be taking care of the animals. So if you've got animals involved, you may want to look at those and make sure that everything within your lab and your handling is good, and that you address all of those items that they talk about. There have been a lot of issues in the last 2 or 3 years about the distress of animals that are being used in research and pain management, and how animals are euthanized. That's how come when they came out with the updates for the 2 years ago, when they split into the non-clinical trial and the clinical trial, they added those questions about how are the animals going to be euthanized. And if you're not using, and I can't remember the sites, like AMA or something, AMBA protocol, you have to explain what you're doing in place of that. The next one that we normally see is the consortium contractual arrangements file. This would be if you have a subcontract involved in your proposal. Most of the time we will load the intent to subcontract letter that we get from the organization that you're doing the subcontract with. And, but there's also like a paragraph or so of information that you're supposed to provide. Very seldom do we have PIs actually provide that information. In fact, I only know of one that normally gives us this information. So I know that normally they'll take the subcontract letter as an entry here, but it's not a complete entry. And I will note here that subcontract doesn't mean like if you're going to someone and you're going to be contracting with them to do something, that they would normally, you could go to anybody and like have them run this test or something. That's not a subcontract. What we're talking about here is an organization who's going to be heavily involved with you, and they are going to help author papers on the research, and they're going to help make programmatic decisions and things like that. So that's a subcontract as far as we're concerned for this area. If you have any letters of support, those all have to be combined into one PDF. There's no way to go and add them like one by one. So if you have one that gets updated or changed in the middle, that means someone has to create a whole new PDF of the letters. They don't provide a lot of information about what the letters should include. I put the page number for the most current description of what they are. They do want you to include information about what they're specifically providing, because if all they're saying is that they love the work and they have use for it, then that's just a letter of endorsement. That's not really a letter of support. They don't want to see bio sketches included with letters of support. Even if you have a consultant that you normally wouldn't think of as a key personnel, it used to be that we could put them here, but a couple of years ago they changed that and said they didn't want to see them because they were seeing bio sketches scattered around, and they want them all with that key personnel form. The resource sharing plan is usually optional, but we usually recommend that you include one, because this is where you can talk about data management, and you don't have to put so much information in your research strategy area. So it's a way to make better use of your space. There are requirements that they have though for when it is mandatory, and so those would be if you have $500,000 or more in direct cost, or if you're using special model organisms or genomic data sharing, then they want you to know that if you don't have a resource sharing plan and you have those involved, your proposal will be rejected. Like I said, we usually recommend that you have one, even if the solicitation doesn't require it, because you can put your data management plan stuff there. Then there's an appendix file. So this is the second place that you can put extra information related to your proposal. There is a list here too of what's acceptable and not acceptable. So you kind of have to look at the guidelines and the general guidelines to see if it qualifies or not. And again, it has the caveat of anything that you load in an appendix section is going to be looked at closely to see if it looks like you're trying to circumvent page limitations. The main thing that we see appendix items loaded here for are PDF attachments of like papers that have been written and things like that that may not have been published yet. If you indicated that human subjects were involved, you will have a human subjects and clinical trials information section on your proposal that needs to be filled out, regardless of whether you have a clinical trial or not. This file is resident in the general applications and also the ones for the clinical trials. So if you just have human subjects involved, it's just going to ask you some questions like, why do you feel like a clinical trial is not involved? Is it exempted research, like you're using de-identified data that somebody else collected years ago and you're not really going out and talking to live people right now? If you say that human subjects are involved, it's going to ask you to provide several files. You have to have studies where you name the study, you talk about who's involved, like white males, white females, Hispanics, things like that. If you have more than one study that's going to be involved, each one has to have a different name because you have to provide files on each study that is going to be involved in the proposed work that you're doing. When you're filling the file out, there are several questions that you have to answer. And if you have one of these forms that has to be filled out, what will happen is your PDS is going to send you an extract of this form. You'll answer all the questions and load the files, and you'll send that little module back to them, and they'll load it up into the application. Make sure that you look at the information related in the guidelines. Don't just assume that a no answer is sufficient. And what I mean by this is, say, for example, you're doing a study on women, and you have a question in there that says something about children or men. And you're like, well, my study is involving women. It's obvious that it's not involving children or men. And so you just answer no. Well, if you looked at the guidelines, it would tell you that you can't just say no. You have to say, why is it no? And there's like 4 entries that you have to make. Otherwise, it's not a complete answer. You have the option of providing a cover letter. Very seldom is one required by a solicitation, but this is usually where you want to indicate special information on the proposal. In years past, this is where a PI would indicate that they wanted a specific study section to look at a certain proposal, or just something was going on that they wanted to make the program officer aware of. Now they use another form to do that. The progress report publication list is only needed if it's a renewal application, because if you're doing a renewal application, they want to know how successful were you in generating data and publications and stuff from the last package of money that they gave you. So they want you to provide an update of all the things that you published from the last award that you have if you're going to go and ask for more money. The SFLLL is a lobbying disclosure form. Most of the time we don't fill those out because we don't officially qualify for lobbying for funds. If it does have to be submitted as part of a mandatory item for your proposal, we'll usually fill one out and just put not applicable on most of the entries. But your PDS will take care of that form for you, so you don't have to worry about it. If you're doing select agent research, they require a file for that. Those are things like if you were using anthrax or biological toxins and things like that, that have a public health risk, that they want special information. There's a special link that you can go to that shows you agents that have to have a form filled out on them. And there's also some that people might think need to have a file filled out for them that are on what they call excluded. You have to address 3 areas in the file. You have to identify the agents, you have to give their registration and their status, and then provide a description of the facilities where they're going to be used, like how are they going to be contained, how are they going to be kept safely, and people are not going to be exposed to them, the training that you have and the protocols on how to handle these dangerous items. If you indicated that there was more than one PI involved, then this is the file that you have to have. It's called the Multiple PI PD Leadership Plan. You have to say why you decided you felt like you needed to have more than one PI. Yes, yes, this is that file. And we pretty much covered the contents. It has to talk about the communication, who's going to make what decisions, who's involved with what. Your PHS assignment request form, this is an optional form, but your PDS usually will recommend that you go ahead and do it, or they'll just send it to you and have you fill it out. This is where you say who you want your proposal to go to when it's submitted. So what division or what study section you want to review your proposal. If you don't fill this out, then your proposal goes in with all the other thousands that are submitted on that day, and a group of people or a machine sits there and looks for keywords, and that's how they decide where your section is going to go to. If you care enough about your funding to submit a proposal, you should be caring enough about it to pick who the review section is going to be. You can pick up to, I think it's 4 or 5 to help give them some guidance. You may not get the first one that you pick. You do have the opportunity, once you're notified who you've been assigned to as far as a review section, if you don't think that's the appropriate one, you can contact your program officer and argue your case of why you think you should be put someplace else. You don't have to complete all the fields that are on there. They ask questions like who the study section you want to look at, who do you want the award funds to come from, if you have any reviewers that you would like to suggest, if you have any reviewers that you want to not have review your proposal. And I will say too that if you've got someone that you don't want to review your proposal, you don't have to give them a long explanation or list of what conflict it was currently or in the past that you had with this person that means you don't want them to review your proposal. All you have to do is say something like they're doing research in a similar area and you have conflicting ideas, or that there is just a personal disagreement with them, something. You don't have to give a long story. The next file is the authentication of key biological and chemical resources file. Almost all proposals will have one of these. This is where you will address if there's anything particular like that you're using to do your research that's not just a general off-the-shelf lab item that's commonly used like gas or something. The reason this is such a big thing the last 2 or 3 years is what they call the rigor and responsibility, because they had people who were getting research results and other people came behind them and couldn't duplicate the results. And so they argued that the reason why they couldn't be duplicated was because they were using XYZ of this particular item. So now NIH is saying, we want you to declare up front where you're getting your stuff from, what the quality, how do you know that you're using a quality gas or something? And you're only given 1 page to do this. Interestingly enough, I know that we had one PI that recently did one and she got a comment back that they didn't think her mice were high enough quality. So they do look at them. On occasion, a solicitation, it may have interactive forms in it. There'll be a link to it and it'll tell you in this specific solicitation. If they do provide an interactive form like that, when you finish completing all the answers on it, make sure that you PDF it. Because usually if an interactive form is loaded back into the grants.gov application file, it'll cause an error. On the budgets, for an NIH budget, you can normally have 2 different types of budget depending on the solicitation. One of them is called the R&R budget form, which is a detailed budget form similar to our spreadsheets. If you've seen those that go away around, they have like all the people, all their salary, all the other personnel, supplies, training or travel and stuff like that. Then they have another one called the modular budget form. The modular budget form is just an entry that says how many modules of 25,000 you used. So for example, the lowest amount you can have on a modular budget is 25,000 because that's a module. You can't have a weird number like 63,000. If you want $63,000 in direct cost and you're doing a modular budget, you have to ask for 100,000 or 75,000. Yeah. NIH is usually mainly concerned with direct cost. So you'll notice on our budget spreadsheets when we send them to you, the direct cost line is usually highlighted so that that stands out for you. They're going to pay the whatever the indirect cost is related to your particular project. So they're only interested in the direct cost. No, it's just on top of it. Sometimes the solicitation will mandate what you're going to use. So for example, if you were going to put in for an R21, R21s are limited to $250,000. So you can't have more than that. And so you'll have, however you want to break the modules up, you could have 150 in year 1 and 100 in year 2, but you can't exceed 250,000. If you want to request more than $500,000 in any one year, you have to get special permission from your program officer, and you have to do that usually 6 weeks prior to submission. If you don't have that authorization, then the recommendation would be for you not to do it, because usually they'll reject the proposal. We mentioned the salary cap before. This is the most current information on what the salary cap is. Usually we'll catch that for you in the budget, and it just means that if Dr. So-and-so is at that salary cap or above, he's not going to get what he would normally receive for his participation in the proposal. They're going to limit it, and they're going to automatically assume that the institution is cost sharing the other amount. Oh, I mentioned back here the no income, it has to be tracked internally. So for example, if they're requesting salary in the summer and they're on a 9-month appointment and they're over the salary cap, that doesn't mean that OU is going to give them extra money in the summer to pay that salary cap difference. It just means that as an institution, we'll track it to make sure that it's reported. Internally at OU, we have a spreadsheet that is used on all proposals. Whether you're doing a modular or a detailed budget, you'll use the OU budget form. Your PDS will take the internal form and will fill out the budget forms for NIH. They can also help you if you're not sure if it's modular or detailed. You can come in and sit down with them and kind of like make a draft budget, so you kind of get an idea where you are going to fall. If you have a subcontract, not only is that going to affect your module amounts, but if you're doing a modular submission versus a detailed submission, it also affects the paperwork that's submitted. So for example, if you're doing a modular submission, all they want is some very basic budget type information, and they don't want to see anything other than your letter of intent from the subcontract. But if you're doing a detailed submission, they want to see detailed information on the subcontract's budget and budget justification. So that means more paperwork is going to have to be loaded to your application for that submission to go in. So on the detailed budget, I mentioned it's kind of similar to the budget that we route. It has line by line entries. 1 year is 3 to 4 pages of entries long, the way they have it divided up. It also has to have a detailed budget justification loaded with it that matches all of the categories that are loaded. And I mentioned before, if it's got a subcontract, it has to have all the subcontracts budget and budget justifications and everything loaded. I will tell you, the first 1 or 2 proposals that you submit, I would advise that you try and do a modular budget, because it makes the process a lot easier the first couple times you do it. Mentioned on the modular budget, the increments are in $25,000 bumps. Usually your PDS, if your direct cost is just a little bit over, we'll talk to you something about, well, you know, can we reduce supplies by 1,000? That brings you down to this module. Or if you're halfway or a little bit more, we'll say, okay, increase supplies. Or we do sometimes what's called modular offset, and we'll just put some funds under modular offset to bring you up to whatever that next module entry is. The budget justifications are different if you're doing a modular submission. All they want is a personnel justification, which talks about the effort and the time that personnel is working on your proposal. If you have a subcontract, they want a consortium justification, and all that says is whether or not the subcontract is a domestic entity or not, and then has their personnel information of how much time and effort is being spent on the proposal. If your modular amounts differ, for example, in one year you have 100,000, in another year you have 200,000, you have to say why they differed. I'm not sure why. A very common explanation is that, for example, maybe in year 2 you added a grad student. So that's all you have to put. The modules are different because in year 2 a grad student was added. Or maybe year 1 was higher because you had equipment. So you just say year 1 was higher than year 2 because you have equipment. So I mentioned before, a subcontract is usually someone that's substantially involved in the proposal. They're going to help you make decisions. They're going to help author any paperwork that goes out, publications that you're doing. A vendor is someone who you can, anybody could go to them to purchase the similar item to what you're doing. So that could be another university if they're doing testing for you. And you don't necessarily have the same arrangement all the time. You could have, for example, OSU on one proposal as a subcontract and another proposal as a vendor. A consultant is someone who's usually involved in a limited way, like for just a short period of time. Maybe they're just coming for a week or two in the summer to help do some tests or provide you some advice. Maybe they're going to be on some type of an advisory board for you. Maybe they're going to be like an external evaluator. So those are some things we normally see consultants for. A consultant may or may not be involved in publication, so that would be up to you as the PI. Usually NIH considers a person who's been coded as a collaborator on their forms as someone who is not receiving any budget figures. Although I have seen people do it, and I don't know that they had any issues calling them a collaborator and giving them some budget funds. Co-investigator is very commonly used as a replacement for co-PI, since they don't recognize the co-PI designation. So I kind of touched on this before. When you're doing the proposal for routing, we need the draft summary or statement of work, the budget on OU's forms, and the draft budget justification. And if you've got a subcontract, we have to have their package. The reason we need their package is because we have to know that their organization has given the clearance that they're going to participate in the proposal. Because when we send in the proposal on your behalf to NIH, we're telling NIH, this is who is going to be on this proposal. That's what they're going to think about when they're making the decisions on whether or not they're going to award you the funds.
Easier for you all if we choose them as collaborators or PIs rather than subcontractors? Is there an extra level of difficulty on your end if we choose one?
It's not the level of the difficulty. It's what is their legal position with you. And there's a spreadsheet, there's a chart we can give you to help you make the decision. Any rates that are used are supposed to be negotiated rates. If you have someone involved that doesn't have a negotiated rate, which we've seen it come up, maybe it's a new organization or a company, there are things that we can do. Either they can direct charge all of their cost, or they can use, there's a federal 10% that's approved for anybody to use. It's also not uncommon that a company, especially some of the public medical companies and things, their overhead or their profit or their rate is considered classified or proprietary information. They do not have to give it to us. All they have to do is provide budget information to go in with the proposal. If the proposal is accepted for funding, the federal agency will contact the company directly, and then they release it to the federal agency. So we have had that come up before. For a vendor, we don't really have to have anything from them. You might want to get a quote, especially if you're dealing with equipment, to help lock them in to those equipment prices, and that's also something good you can add to your budget justification if you're doing a detailed budget justification. For a consultant, we recommend that you have an email from them where they say how much they want for whatever it is that you want them to do. A good way to get this is to just send them an email and say, hey, Joe, just want to confirm you're going to do blah, blah, blah for my proposal for $5,000 a year. They respond, yes. Now you've got something that shows you've got an agreement. On more than one occasion, we've had an award come in and the person who was going to be the consultant forgot the exchange ever took place, and now they don't want 5,000, they want 10. So that means you've either got to find a new consultant or you've got to rework your budget to come up with the extra funds. So the submission paperwork is pretty similar for a detailed budget versus a modular submission. Your performance site information is going to stay the same. The cover page entries are going to stay the same. You're still going to have a letter of support if you have a PI that's external from OU saying that they know that they're involved and what they're going to provide. We would have to have a letter from their organization that acknowledges that they know that they're going to be involved in a subcontract and the amount that they're expected to receive. If it's going to be a detailed submission, they may also have to give us what's called an R&R subcontract budget form. So we have to send them this whole budget file that they have to fill out for each year that they're receiving funds. And then they send us that file back and we merge it into the application file. And if most of the colleges and universities that we deal with, this is just normal stuff. So if the budget's going to be a detailed budget, they know that they're going to have to give us an R&R budget form. So now we're going to go into some of the common errors that we see that either prevent a successful proposal, or if we have enough time, we can clear it before the submission. So if there were missing attachments, like if you answered yes that there's human subjects and then you missed giving an attachment to one of the files that covers human subjects, that you indicate that you have multiple PIs, but you don't have a multiple PI leadership plan, that you don't have anything loaded for contractual arrangements. Page limits being exceeded, especially for the research strategy, is a common error that's seen at NIH when they're doing their reviews. We try and catch the page limit stuff if we can, but a lot depends on how many proposals we've got going in the same day.
I may have missed this, but I'm assuming that there's an assumption here that everybody's done IRB and all of those things, or is there?
So the question.
Process interface with the proposal process.
Okay. So the question is, how does the IRB process interface with the proposal process? So at the point of submission, unless the specific solicitation says otherwise, all you have to do is indicate any IRB or ICOOK is pending. Okay. Now, if you indicated on the info sheet that you had biohazards, DNA, or radioisotopes, you have to have an initial type of clearance from the IBC for those. But they don't require you to do the whole protocol or anything. You just send them that you're doing a proposal and this is what's involved, and they'll send you back a letter that says, when you get picked for award, you've got to come through us and complete the process, get the training and stuff like that. Very rarely do they require that you have all of the protocols and everything all finished when you're doing it. Now, if you have made some contact with like IRB, that can help you answer some of the questions sometimes in the extra files that are needed for human subjects. I think that was it for that page. The general format guidance. So for example, you use the wrong font or the wrong size of font, or you had more than 15 characters per inch, or you adjusted the leading between sentences so that they were right on top of each other. So basically what they're looking at is whatever you send them has got to be readable. You haven't gained anything if you made everything so small and so hard to read that the reviewers have a hard time looking at it. And that's what led to all of these requirements. Most of the time when you look at enough of these, you can tell when someone has played around with the font size pretty easily and the leading, because they just don't look the same as all the rest of them look. They have software programs now that are looking for these. So they are not relying on somebody to whip out a ruler and measure them, which is what we used to do. There aren't any restrictions on text color, but they do recommend that you look to make sure that what you're submitting is easy to read, because if you're doing something in like orange or lime, that may not stand out if the thing is printed and the person's looking at a print copy of it. You should use regular paper size, 8.5 by 11. Usually it's recommended that you try and do most, if not all, on like a regular portrait standpoint, and don't mix pages, portrait, landscape, because then that if a reviewer prints it out, it's going to make it hard for them to handle. Margins are 1/2 inch on all sides. Sometimes you will notice when the file that we send you back that's been loaded into Cayuse, it looks a little bit small on the margins. It's just something to do with the software. When it actually goes into eCommons, it's fine. The main thing is to make sure that your source file meets all of these requirements, because if there's ever a question at NIH, we're going to come back to you for the source file so that we can argue on your behalf and say, you can open this file and you can look and see they had Times New Roman 12 when they did this file. They give you specific format, the form sometimes. They also give you examples on some of these on the NIH website. You're not supposed to put security features on any of the PDFs that you upload, because they want to be able to open them and manipulate them the way that they want to. File name should be 50 characters or less. A lot of times you'll send us a file name, and most of the time we will truncate it. So like you may send something that says mole rats, abstract, submission, blah, blah, blah. And we're going to just say abstract, and that's what we're going to load, because that reduces problems in that area. They recommend you don't put a lot of spaces or dashes in the file names, because sometimes those can cause problems with the file being able to be uploaded or transmitted over the servers. You can only use hyperlinks or URLs when the guidelines tell you that they can be used. Most of the time in the research strategy, they're not allowed. Their thought being that reviewers are not going to go to a hyperlink to look at information that you have posted. And if they did, it would give you an unfair advantage over someone else who didn't provide information in that manner. We talked about circumventing page limits. They don't want you to put headers and footers. And this, years ago, they used to require that you put headers and footers like your last name and stuff like that. They don't want that anymore, because the software now automatically adds headers and footers to all of the pages. So you don't have to worry about that. But they do want you to put section divisions of the areas that you're working on. So talking to NIH. So over the life cycle of the grant, you might talk to the program officer at the institute as the submission is going on, especially like before you even make a lot of headway to figure out your institution. Send them the little one-pager to make sure you're in the right spot and see if they have some advice they want to give you. Most of the time, you're not going to talk to your science officer that's on the review committee unless they reach out to you. In fact, a lot of times you'll receive an email that cautions you not to contact the science officer or anybody that is on the review panel, because it could be considered that you're trying to influence the review. When the review is finished, you might be contacted for more information. If you are, you're expected to respond in a timely manner. Sometimes they'll give you really quick turnaround times. There have been a couple of times that we've had questions come in while proposals were in the review committee, and they usually only give you between 2 to 4 days to respond to that. If you don't respond to the question at that point, then they just move on to another proposal that they're looking at. And this talks about the timing too. So peer review normally takes place 3 to 4 months after the proposal has been submitted. And you can look in ERA Commons and it'll tell you the status of your proposal. So it'll tell you when it's been put into a study section, it'll tell you what study section, and then it'll also tell you when they're starting to pull it, the panels to review them. When the review is finished, that's usually at 5 to 6 months. If you're not selected for funding, that's when you'll start receiving your comments, so you know how you did. And then usually your funding will come in at 9 months. And I'll caveat that with saying the funding may or may not come at 9 months, because it depends on if the budget has been approved in Congress, because if there's been any holdups there, it'll push back all the funding actions that are going to take place. I need to get rid of all these spacing ones. So you contact your program officer. The SRO is ORS, that's our office, Sponsored Research Office. So when you're thinking you know what your research area is going to be and you want to talk to the program officer, when you've identified your funding announcement that you're going to submit to, you want to talk to our office. If you've got any questions about the grant process or anything like that, at the very start, that's when you want to start reaching out to everybody. After the submission, but before the peer review, you can contact us pretty much anytime. The science officer, sometimes you can do a little contact with him, but as soon as the peer review starts, you're not allowed to contact the science officer anymore. Once the review is finished and you've got the results back, you can talk to the program officer and get their input on the comments, especially if there's some that you don't understand or you don't agree with. And any budget questions or anything like that, you can always talk to the program officer or the grants specialist. This is the NIH. There was something else I was going to say there. I'm not sure if I mentioned this later or not. I think I do, but just in case. As your proposal is being selected to go into the review panel, you have the opportunity, if you want, to ask your program officer to sit in on the review for you so that they can hear the comments that are made about your proposal as it's being reviewed. And if they have the time, they will do it and get back with you and let you know what the discussions were. So program officers work for the Institute. They do play a role in the funding decisions that are made. If it comes down to 2 proposals and they think one has more merit than another, the one that they put their weight behind is usually the one that's going to get picked. You need to make sure that whatever your research ideal is, that it's going to fit in with the mission and the work that that institute is trying to foster research in. And you might ask if they can give you, if you don't have good ideas on what the impact and stuff of your research is, you might ask them for some information. If you're not sure about the study section that you need to recommend, you can ask them for some recommendations for that too. It is considered that the program officers work for you, but they're not going to want to be on the phone with you for 10 hours a day. So you want to make sure when you're talking with them that you know what it is, your questions, like make a note of what your questions are so you don't get into rambling and waste their time. And it's always good the first time that you start to reach out to them is to give them some information about your areas of research. That's how come we recommend doing a one-pager to send them, so that you're not just making a cold call from them, kind of filling them out and what they might be interested in and stuff like that. Another thing you want to consider is go and meet your program officer. You can apply for internal funding to get permission to go and meet some of your different program officers and start to develop a relationship with them. The program officers at NIH are usually there for many years. NSF program officers usually rotate out every 2 to 3 years. NIH could be there the whole career, really. Um, so your scientific officer works for the center that they're assigned to. So they're not as ready to give you a lot of their time because that's not what they're there for. Your program officer is the person who's supposed to be doing a lot of hand-holding with you. The science officer is a non-voting member of the review panel. They help facilitate and guide the discussion, but they don't have a vote. Now, they can put their opinion down within certain frameworks that may be considered when the funding decisions are made. There is a site that you can go to that has more information about the different people who look at your application and the impact that they have on decisions that are made or the formation of the review panels. When all the applications are done and the scores are received back from that review panel, it goes to the IC Review Council. The council includes your program officer who sits on it and helps represent your interest as the panel is meeting. If you know that your proposal has gone out of the review panel and into the review council, you can talk to your program officer and ask them questions about how the review went or just pretty much anything that you want to. They'll decide if they want to answer it or not. Usually within 3 days after it goes through the review council, you'll get your impact score, which is like your overall score, and a summary statement usually comes out 4 to 8 weeks, usually about 6 to 7 time frame. So you kind of have an idea of what was discussed when the study section met. There is a list of status codes on like if you were recommended for funding or not, or where you fell within the pay line and stuff like that. That's available on that link. If you were recommended for funding, usually you're going to see that at about 9 months. So this is something you want to keep in mind when you're developing your budget. Most of the time, you're not going to see funding for 9 to 12 months after you submit the proposal. So you want to set your budget and your start date up to be 9 to 12 months from the submission date. It is very probable that if you get contacted by the program officer or NIH regarding questions or other information that they want, or that they want just-in-time materials is what they'll call it, which is when they will want your detailed budget if you submitted a modular budget. They'll want an update to your biosketch, and they'll want your current pending information. So that's commonly just-in-time or JIT information. When you get those contacts, don't assume that we've also gotten that information. So reach back out to either your PDS or your SPC and give a heads up that these discussions are going on. Because a lot of times what we see is the PI may know for 2 or 3 weeks that they've asked for this information, but we get notified 2 or 3 days before it's due. And so that puts us in a crunch situation. Okay. So I mentioned you can see status and ERA Commons. So this is the screen where you can see stuff. So your summary statement is available here. These are your scores. It tells you where you ranked with everybody else too. And sometimes there's extra information there that you can pull open. This is a list of links of places where you can go to get information. One of the things that I also want to mention as far as reviews at NIH go, someone who's picked to sit on a review panel, especially if it's not a person who is a new reviewer or a person who's considered just a generalist, like a general population reviewer. Like, I don't have a science degree, but I could go and sit on a review panel as just a member of the public. Once you're seated for a review panel, usually you're seated for 3 to 6 years, 6 years being the common. So chances are, if you submit an application you're going to have the same panel or a very good portion of the same panel looking at your proposal the second time. So keep that in mind. You don't want to go off the deep end if you don't agree with the comments that a reviewer make. You don't want to respond that you think that the reviewer that made these comments is an idiot because they didn't see what you were trying to point out. You laugh, but you would be surprised. So it's very probable that the same person could be on your review panel or that their friends might be. You can also, if you look hard enough at the division where you're going into, you can sometimes find a list of the reviewers who are actually going to be seated on your review panel while your proposal is still in work. And if they're experts in your career field, it might be wise to look at if they've got something that you want to cite to include. So if I've got questions, who do I get a hold of? So if you've got a question related to anything in the proposal research process and you can't figure out who it is you need to ask, pop it off to rs@ou.edu or research@ou.edu, and someone will respond. Cindy's our training manager, and she's been working on setting up a bunch of training, and we're hoping to get a lot more resources online. We're kind of way behind where we would have liked to have been because we kind of were overcome with all of the stuff that happened with splitting pre and post and CRPDE going away, and they dismantled the outreach grants people, so their work came over here, some other people did. So it's just been a crazy year for us. So we're hoping to make a lot of headway on the website next year, but there's a lot of good information that's already there. You've got your contacts for your PDS and your SPC. Most normally they're by last name or by a specific area that they work. There will probably be some changes coming to that in the near future because of some people that we picked up from outreach. Your PDS is the best person to talk to if you've got questions about guidelines or the budget or a submission system. Your SPC is the person to talk to if you've got questions about a submission that's already gone in, maybe some negotiation stuff you're starting to get questions related to negotiation. You have to be very careful what you say to program officers or grants people at the sponsoring agency, especially if it's not technical related. So you can answer their technical questions all day long. If they start talking budget or agreements in terms of conditions and things like that, that's when you need to hold up the hand and say, we need to get my contracts person involved. We've had several instances where PI made what they thought were benign comments that had big repercussions. For example, we had one last year. PI was having a conversation. He mentioned that he was done with that part of the project. The program manager, sponsored person, interpreted that to mean that everything for that budget period was done. We still had outstanding invoices for the subcontracts that hadn't processed, and they put a halt to all the spending. We work closely with the Center for Faculty Excellence, which is the new center that stood up with Carol Silva, that has a research arm under it that Marilyn Corhonen is working in. If we get questions from you and we think that it should go to them or that they can help you, like with the ORCID ID stuff, then we'll put you in contact with them.